The dust that settled over Harlan Creek, Texas in the spring of 1882 was the kind that got into your teeth and stayed there. And Maria Keene had learned to taste it without complaint, the same way she had learned to taste grief, quietly and alone. She stood at the edge of her porch on a Tuesday morning when the sun had barely cleared the ridge, looking out over the 40 acres that she and her husband Thomas had carved out of scrubland and stubbornness 7 years prior. Thomas was gone now 18 months in the ground, taken by a fever that had swept through the valley the previous winter, with the kind of mercilessness that the land out here seemed to reserve for the people who loved it most. What remained was Maria, 31 years old, 2 children, 4 cattle, a broke-down plow, and a mortgage that had come due with a banker's indifference to widowhood. Her hands, as she gripped the porch railing that morning, were not the hands of the girl who had come west from San Antonio with starry ideas and a new husband. They were calloused along the palms, cracked at the knuckles, brown from sun and wind, and strong in the way that only real labor makes a person strong. She did not hide them. She had stopped wearing gloves outside months ago because gloves slowed her down, and she did not have time to be slowed down. Her daughter, Clara, was 6. Her son, James, was 9. Both were inside eating cornmeal mush, and both were going to need new boots before the season turned again, which meant Maria needed money, which meant Maria needed a loan, which meant Maria had to do the one thing she had been putting off since the notice arrived: walk into the First Territorial Bank of Harlan Creek and speak to Dorian Schraft, the branch manager, who was the kind of man who smiled at widows the way cats smile at trapped mice. She dressed carefully that morning. Not because she cared what anyone thought of her, but because she understood that the world judged a woman's credibility by what she wore into a bank, and Maria Keene had not survived this long by ignoring the world's cruelties. She wore her dark blue wool dress, the one Thomas had bought her for their 5th anniversary, brushed clean and pressed with the flat iron the night before. Her hair was pulled back tight into a knot at the base of her neck, not a single strand loose. Her boots, worn but polished, clicked with purpose on the wooden boards of the porch as she walked to the wagon. She told James to look after Clara. He was 9 and serious about it, and he nodded with that particular gravity that boys in hard places develop early, a solemnity that broke her heart a little every single time she saw it. She kissed them both and drove the wagon into town, alone, with the loan papers folded against her chest. Harlan Creek was the kind of small western town that had its own particular rhythm, and by 1882 it had settled into a kind of dusty, sun-baked permanence. The main street ran straight through the center, flanked on both sides by wooden storefronts. The general store, the telegraph office, 2 saloons, a blacksmith, the barber shop, the post office, and at the far end, wide and whitewashed and faintly superior in its construction, the First Territorial Bank of Harlan Creek. There was a hotel above the saloon and a church at the opposite end of town, and between them on any given weekday you could find most of the human drama of the region playing out in miniature. Maria tied her horse to the post outside the bank at 9:30. She straightened her back. She pulled in a long breath. She was not afraid. She was something harder than afraid. She was determined, and determination, she had found, looked a great deal like pride from the outside. She pushed through the bank door and walked in. The First Territorial Bank of Harlan Creek had a high ceiling, pressed tin in decorative squares above, and dark wood paneling along the walls. There were 2 teller windows on the left, a long wooden bench against the right wall, and at the far end, behind a low wooden railing that separated the public floor from the official territory of the bank's staff, was Dorian Schraft's desk. Schraft himself was already there, speaking in low tones with another man, Harold Pitts, owner of the feed store, who was apparently completing some transaction of his own. There were a few other people in the bank that morning. A farm wife at one of the teller windows counting coins, an older man in a gray coat waiting on the bench, and in the far corner to the right of the entrance, half-shadowed, Sitting in one of the two wooden chairs that flanked a small side table was a man Maria had not seen before. He was large, not in a loud way, but in the way of a man who worked with his body and had done so for many years, broad through the shoulders and long in the leg, with weathered hands resting flat on his thighs. He wore a dark brown hat that he had not removed, and beneath the brim his face was angular and still, with deep-set eyes of an unusual gray-green color that were currently observing the room with the quiet attention of someone who made a habit of watching. His jaw was shaded with a few days of growth. His clothes, dark canvas trousers, a wool shirt, a leather vest were clean but clearly working clothes, not Sunday clothes. On the chair beside him sat a pair of leather saddlebags, and one thumb was hooked idly into the pocket of his vest. He looked at Maria when she came in, not the way some men looked at women in the West, not with the calculating hunger of a man who saw a widow as an opportunity, and not with the pitying softness of a man who could not help but remind a woman of what she had lost. He looked at her the way a person looks at someone they find genuinely interesting, a clear and level attention that took in the pressed dress, the firm jaw, the careful posture, and seemed to register it all without judgment. Maria did not pay him further mind. She crossed the floor, stepped up to Dorian Schraft's window on the front desk. Schraft had finished with Harold Pitts and was now reviewing some document, and placed her folded loan papers on the counter between them. "Mr. Schraft," she said, "I've come to speak with you about the Keene property loan. I sent a letter in January. I'd like to arrange an extension and a restructuring of the repayment terms." Dorian Schraft was a man of 50, with small eyes behind wire spectacles and a mustache that seemed to carry its own opinion of people. He looked at the papers, then looked at Maria over the tops of his spectacles, and the calculation that moved through his expression was not a kind one. "Mrs. Keene," he said, "yes, I received your letter." He picked up the papers without urgency, unfolded them, and studied them with the unhurried patience of a man who held all the cards and knew it. "I have to be frank with you. The situation on your loan is not favorable. You are 6 months in arrears on the interest payments and the principal." "I know the principal," Maria said. Her voice was even and quiet. "I know every number on that document. I've memorized them. What I'm asking for is a restructuring, a new schedule. I have the cattle, I have the acreage, I have a harvest coming in the fall. I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking for the same consideration any landholder in this county would receive." Schraft's mustache twitched. "Any landholder with a cosigner, perhaps, or with another source of income to demonstrate capacity for repayment. The bank's position, Mrs. Keene, is that a property operated by—" He paused, and the pause was its own kind of insult. "A single individual, without the backing of a formal business arrangement or a secondary signatory, represents an elevated risk that the bank cannot comfortably." "The property produced 220 bushels of wheat last autumn," Maria said, "and I've taken in mending work all winter. The cattle are healthy. I have every intention of—" "Mrs. Keene." Schraft's voice was not cruel, which almost made it worse. It was the voice of a man who had rehearsed this conversation in his head many times and was simply performing the inevitable. "Without a cosigner on the restructured agreement, I'm afraid the bank cannot offer you terms. And without new terms, the existing loan comes due in full at the end of next month. Those are simply the conditions." The room was quiet enough that Maria could hear the coins being counted at the teller window. She could hear the creak of the man on the bench shifting his weight. She could hear her own heartbeat, which was faster than she would have liked, though she kept her face still as stone. "I don't have a cosigner," she said. "I don't have family in the county. My husband's brother is in Missouri, and I haven't written to him because I don't need charity from a man who couldn't be bothered to come west with us in the first place. What I have is land and livestock and a work record and 2 children who are counting on me to walk out of this bank with a solution. So I'm asking you one more time. I understand your difficulty," Schraft said, and folded her papers back toward her. But the bank's policy, the sound of a chair sliding back was not loud, but it carried. It was the deliberate sound of a large man rising without hurry, and it drew the attention of everyone in the room the way a quiet bell will draw attention in a silent room. The man from the corner stood up. He crossed the floor with an unhurried, even stride, and he stopped beside Maria, not in front of her, not behind her, but beside her, shoulder almost at her ear, and he looked at Dorian Shraft with those gray-green eyes that held a quality of steadiness that was, in its own way, formidable. "I'll co-sign," he said. His voice was low and measured, with the particular baritone of a man who did not raise his voice because he had never needed to in order to be heard. He said it without dramatic emphasis, without performance. He said it the way a man says something he has already decided. Shraft blinked. "I beg your pardon. I said I'll co-sign for Mrs. Keene's loan." He reached into the inner pocket of his vest and drew out a folded document of his own, a letter, it appeared, with a seal at the bottom. He placed it on the counter beside Maria's papers. "That's a letter of credit from the Cattlemen's Savings Institution in Abilene. You're welcome to verify it. My name is Walter Cooper. I run the Double C spread, 30 miles northeast of here, 600 acres, 200 head. I've had accounts with 3 banks in this territory without a single default. I'll put my name on whatever paper you need." There was a silence that lasted several seconds. Maria turned and looked at him for the first time straight on, and the thing she felt in that moment was not gratitude, not immediately. The first thing she felt was a fierce, clean flash of something very close to anger, because she was a woman who had come here to solve her own problem, and she did not make a habit of requiring rescue. But the anger shifted almost immediately into something more complicated, because she looked at this man and saw in his expression something she had not expected to find. He was not looking at Shraft with arrogance. He was not looking at her with pity. He was looking at Shraft with the simple, unmistakable conviction of a man who had looked at a situation, judged it to be wrong, and decided to do something about it. "Excuse me," Maria said to him, keeping her voice low enough not to carry across the whole room. "I don't know you." "Walter Cooper," he said, turning to look at her, and now those gray-green eyes were on her directly, which was a slightly different experience than observing them from across the room. "I know who you are. Tom Keene's widow. He ran cattle on the west slope of the ridge. We shared a fence line along the northern boundary. We nodded to each other at the cattlemen's meeting in Childress 2 years ago, though I don't expect you remember. I'm sorry about Tom. He was a good man." Maria studied him for a moment. She did, faintly, remember the meeting in Childress. She remembered Thomas coming home and saying the Cooper fellow who ran the spread to the northeast was a man worth knowing. She had not at the time placed particular weight on the comment because Thomas said that about most men who were not obviously scoundrels. "This is my matter to handle," she said. "I know that," Walter Cooper said quietly, "and you're handling it well. But if Shraft here needs a second signature to give you what's fair, then I'm offering to provide it. You can pay me back in handshakes and nothing else. I'm not doing this because you need saving. I'm doing it because what he's doing is wrong and I happen to be in a position to make it right." He paused. "If you'll let me." Shraft, behind the counter, was looking between them with an expression that had gained a certain watchful quality, the expression of a man who has been playing a game and has suddenly discovered that the board has changed. Maria looked at Walter Cooper for 3 full seconds. She looked at his eyes, which were steady and honest. She looked at his hands on the counter, which were the hands of a working man, not a rich man playing games. She looked at the letter of credit from Abilene, which was real and bore a seal she recognized. Then she turned back to Shraft. "You heard Mr. Cooper," she said. "Draw up the restructured agreement, 12-month repayment schedule, standard interest. And you will accept his co-signature." Shraft cleared his throat and reached for his ledger. They were in the bank for another 40 minutes while the agreement was drafted and reviewed. Maria read every line. She questioned 2 clauses, one regarding penalty fees and one regarding the bank's right to reassess collateral and extracted modifications on both. Walter Cooper stood beside her and said almost nothing, except once, when Schraft attempted to insert language that would have given the bank priority claim on livestock in a default scenario, at which point Walter said quietly, "That clause is not standard," and Schraft removed it without argument. When the document was signed, Maria's signature first, clear and firm, and then Walter's beside it, Maria folded her copy, placed it inside her coat, and turned to the door. Walter followed her out. They stood on the boardwalk outside the bank in the spring morning, the sun warm on the boards, the street active with the ordinary business of Harlan Creek. "Thank you," Maria said. She said it directly and without elaboration, because she had been raised to give sincere thanks sincerely, and she gave it that way now. "You're welcome," Walter said. He held his hat in both hands now, having taken it off as they exited, and his hair beneath it was dark brown with threads of gray at the temples, which placed him, she estimated, in his late 30s. He looked at her with an expression she could not quite name, not expectant, not satisfied, simply present, in the way of a person who has done a thing, and is now simply standing in the aftermath of it without agenda. "You should know," Maria said, "that I intend to have that loan paid off in 10 months, not 12. I don't plan on your name being on my papers any longer than it has to be." "I don't doubt it," he said, and there was something in the way he said it, not patronizing, something more like genuine respect, that made her look at him again. "Can I ask what you were doing in the bank this morning?" she said. "You didn't approach any teller, you were just sitting there." "Waiting for Harris, he's the senior manager, to come back from lunch. I had business of my own." He paused, though Harris apparently took a long lunch. Despite everything and against her will and her expectation, Maria Keene almost smiled. Almost. "Goodbye, Mr. Cooper," she said, and she walked to her wagon and drove home. She told herself on the drive back that she would not think about him. She had a farm to run, children to raise, a loan to repay, cattle to tend, and a plow that needed a new iron fitting before she could turn the south field. She was a practical woman with practical concerns, and a rancher she had spoken to for 40 minutes in a bank was not one of those concerns. She thought about him intermittently for the rest of the week, not in a foolish way, not in the way of a woman who had forgotten herself. She thought about the quiet steadiness of his voice. She thought about the fact that he had stood beside her, not in front of her. She thought about what he had said, "not because you need saving," and she turned it over in her mind the way you turn a coin over to examine both sides, looking for the catch, because in her experience there was always a catch. She could not find one. She was in the south field on Saturday morning, 3 days after the bank, attempting to assess the extent of damage to the plow's iron coulter, which had cracked over the winter in a frost, when she heard hoofbeats on the road. She stood up and shaded her eyes with her hand, and watched a large dark horse come along the track toward the farm at an easy canter. Walter Cooper. He stopped at the fence and dismounted and held up a hand when she looked at him, in the gesture of a man announcing peaceful intentions. "Mrs. Keene," he said. "Mr. Cooper." She did not move from the plow. Her hands were black with grease from the coulter. She was wearing her work dress, which was older than the one she had worn to the bank and more honest. "I came to look at your fence line," he said. "The northern boundary. We share it, and I know Tom didn't have a chance to ride it before." He stopped. "I should have come before now, and I didn't. That was my fault. I'd like to ride it now and see what needs doing, if that's acceptable to you." Maria considered him. There was a post on the northern fence that had been leaning since last summer, and she had meant to get to it and hadn't, because there was always something more urgent. A leaning post was a small thing. A downed fence was a problem. "It's acceptable," she said. He nodded. He tied his horse to the post and opened the gate and walked in, and then he stopped and looked at what she was doing with the plow. "The coulter," he said. "Cracked," she said. "I need to get it to the blacksmith. But I can't get it to the blacksmith until I can lift it off, and I need a second pair of hands to hold the frame while I work the pin." Walter took off his coat. He hung it on the fence post. He rolled up his sleeves. He crouched beside the plow on the other side and without any discussion put his hands on the frame. "Ready," he said. She worked the pin. It took 4 minutes and required more force than she had been able to apply alone. When the coulter came free, she lifted it away and set it aside, and Walter set the frame down gently and straightened up. "Thank you," she said. "You were close," he said. "Another few minutes and you'd have had it." "I know," she said. And then, because it was simply true, and she was a woman who told the truth. But this was faster. They rode the fence line together that afternoon on horseback, Maria on her roan mare and Walter on his dark bay. And the land was beautiful the way the Texas hill country is beautiful in spring green gold, with wildflowers coming up along the rocky draws and the sky so wide and blue overhead that it looked like something painted. They found the leaning post, and 2 others that needed attention, and 1 section of wire that had come off the staples entirely. Walter dismounted and pulled wire staples from the small leather pouch he had brought in his saddlebag, as if he had known there would be wire to fix, which suggested he had looked at this fence before and had some idea of its condition. "You've been watching this fence," Maria said from her horse. "I drive past the boundary twice a week," he said, working the staple into the post with the flat of his hand and a small hammer from the same pouch. "I noticed the wire in February." "You could have come and told me in February." He looked up at her. "I thought about it," he said honestly. "I didn't want to presume." Maria looked at him for a moment. "So you went to the bank and co-signed my loan instead," she said, with a tone that was not quite accusatory and not quite amused but contained elements of both. "That was different," he said, going back to the staple. "In the bank you were being done wrong. That required action. A fence post only requires a conversation, and I wasn't sure you'd want it." "I'm having it now," she said. "Yes," he said. "You are." He fixed 3 sections of fence that afternoon while she held the wire, and they talked while they worked, not about anything particularly significant, but in the easy, provisional way of 2 people who are cautiously investigating whether they speak the same language. He told her he had come to Texas from Colorado, following cattle country south 8 years prior. She told him she had grown up in San Antonio, that her father had been a saddle maker, that she had learned to ride before she learned to read. He told her he had one hand at the Double C, an older Mexican cowhand named Felix who had been with him for 5 years and was, in his estimation, worth 3 ordinary men. She told him that James had started helping with the cattle in the mornings before school, which made her proud and broke her heart simultaneously. He listened when she talked. Not the polite listening of a man waiting for his turn to speak, but genuine listening, the kind where the other person's words land and settle and are reflected back in the questions that follow. It was, Maria realized somewhat reluctantly, a rare quality. When they finished with the fence and were riding back toward the house, the afternoon light had gone amber and long, and James had come out of the house and was standing at the gate with the particular alert stillness of a 9-year-old boy regarding an unknown man. Walter stopped his horse and looked at James with a respect she had not expected. "This your place?" Walter asked him, as if it were a serious question. James looked at his mother, then back at Walter. "My mother's place," he said. "I help." "Good man," Walter said without condescension, just direct and even the way he said everything. "She needs good help." James considered this for a moment, then nodded with a gravity that almost broke Maria's heart again, that solemn, too-old nod. Walter did not stay for supper, which Maria noted, because it was the kind of detail that told you something about a man. He did not invite himself, and he did not maneuver for an invitation. He said good evening, and he mounted up, and he rode back along the track toward the main road. He came back 2 weeks later. This time he brought Felix with him, the older cowhand, a lean and weathered man of about 60 with silver hair under a wide hat and a mustache that put Schrafft's to shame, and the 2 of them spent the better part of a day repairing the broken gate on the west pasture, which had been Maria's next project, and had been on her list for 3 weeks. She had not asked for this. They had come because Walter had noticed the gate when he rode out the last time, and had decided it needed fixing. Maria stood in the yard and watched them work, and felt a complicated knot of feelings in her chest that she was not ready to untangle. "He is a good man," Felix told her at one point in the straightforward way of a person who has simply arrived at a truth and sees no reason not to say it. He was drinking the coffee she had brought out. "Not a complicated one, straightforward like the land. That is rare." "I've noticed," Maria said, and was mildly annoyed with herself for saying it. Felix smiled at his coffee cup. After that, it seemed to happen gradually, and then all at once. The way things do when two people are both too proud and too careful to admit what is happening between them. Walter came by the farm with increasing regularity, always with some useful purpose, always contributing something concrete and practical, as if love, or whatever this was, could only be expressed in work and competence and showing up. He helped her get the south field turned once she had the coulter replaced. He brought lumber for the chicken coop that had gone half to rot. He rode into Harlan Creek with her once when she needed to negotiate with the feed store, and said almost nothing, but his presence was a kind of authority that changed the terms of the conversation, a fact Maria both resented and acknowledged. She owed him no tenderness for any of it, and she told herself this frequently. He did not ask for tenderness. He did not ask for anything. He came and he worked and he talked with her when they were in proximity to each other, and she found herself looking forward to those conversations in a way that startled her each time she caught herself doing it. The first time he stayed for supper was in late May, when Clara had attached herself to his knee while he was sitting on the porch talking to Maria about cattle prices, and Walter had looked down at the 6-year-old with an expression of such genuine and undefended delight. Because Clara was a person who could dissolve most kinds of guardedness simply by existing, that Maria had looked away for a moment, because the sight of it touched something she was not ready to have touched. "Mr. Cooper is staying for supper," Clara announced to her mother, as if this had already been decided. Maria looked at Walter over the top of Clara's head. "If there's enough," he said carefully. "There is," Maria said, because there was. Supper was cornbread and salt pork and beans, and after supper Walter helped James carry water from the well to the garden, which was not a task anyone had assigned him and was in fact the kind of task that nobody sees unless they are looking, which meant he was looking. Maria watched from the kitchen window and felt the knot in her chest pull tighter and shift. He left it dark. On the porch briefly before he went to his horse, he stopped and turned to her and said, "Maria." It was the first time he had called her by her first name. He said it as if he had been practicing the decision. She looked at him. "I'd like to call on you properly," he said. "Not under the pretense of fences or gates or anything else, just properly." His voice was even, but there was something in it that was not entirely steady, and she found, unexpectedly, that this pleased her. "If you would consider it." She stood with the lamplight at her back and the spring night air around her and the sound of the crickets starting up in the grass, and she looked at Walter Cooper, at his honest face and his good, strong, working hands and the careful way he was looking at her, as if she were something worth being careful about. "I would consider it," she said. He nodded once. He settled his hat on his head. He got on his horse and rode away, and she stood on the porch for longer than was strictly necessary and watched the dark swallow him up. She did not sleep particularly well that night. He came on Sunday the following week in a clean shirt. He brought a small jar of honey, the real kind, from a beekeeper in chill dress, and left it on the porch rail without ceremony, as if it were simply a thing that had needed to be delivered. Clara seized it immediately with a shriek of delight, and James looked at the jar, and then at Walter with an expression that was simultaneously measuring and cautiously interested. They sat on the porch that Sunday evening and talked without work to do, which was different and somewhat more exposing than talking over fence wire or cattle numbers. He told her about his early years in Colorado, how he had spent 3 years as a trail hand driving cattle north out of Texas, before he had scraped together enough money to buy his first parcel of land. She told him about San Antonio, about her father's workshop, about the smell of leather and the sound of her mother singing in the kitchen. She told him about meeting Thomas at a church social, how he had spilled lemonade on her dress, and then stood there so utterly horrified with himself that she had started laughing, and that had been that. She said Thomas's name easily, the way she had learned to, not without feeling, but without being undone by it. Walter listened to her talk about her husband and did not look uncomfortable or jealous or anything other than attentive, which she respected. "What about you?" she asked. Was there someone? He was quiet for a moment. "There was a woman in Colorado," he said. 8 years ago, Margaret. She was from Ohio and she wanted to go back and I wanted to go south. We parted ways without anything broken between us. She married a schoolteacher in Cleveland." He paused. "I heard she was happy. I was glad." "No bitterness?" Maria asked. "No," he said. "We wanted different things. That's not a wound. That's just life." Maria looked at the horizon where the last of the sunset had gone to deep purple. "You're a straightforward man," she said, almost quoting Felix without meaning to. "I try to be," he said. "It's unusual," she said. "Maybe," he said. "Or maybe other men just don't give it enough practice." She laughed. It came out before she could consider it. A real laugh, and she put her hand over her mouth in a brief reflex of surprise. And Walter looked at her with something in his face that was warm and private and entirely unguarded. And the combination of those things did something to her chest that she was not at all sure she was prepared for. The summer came in hard and hot, the way Texas summers do, with a heat that baked the soil to concrete and turned the creek half to mud by July. Maria worked through it with the undeviating determination of a woman who has no alternative, rising before dawn, working till dark, sleeping in the narrow bed that had once been wide enough for two. The loan payments came due monthly, and she made them on time, every one with a precision that was almost aggressive. She was not going to fail. She had made herself this promise, and she kept it the way she kept all her promises, which was to say completely. Walter came twice a week, sometimes 3 times. He always had a reason that made practical sense. The reasons were real, there were always real things to do, but they both understood by mid-July that the reasons were secondary. He came because he wanted to be there. She let him come because she wanted him there. Neither of them said this out loud for some time, which was its own kind of courtship, circling the truth at a respectful distance. On a Wednesday evening in late July, a problem arrived that had nothing to do with fence lines or bank loans. A man named Cord Latimer came by the farm at dusk. Latimer was a land speculator who had come into the valley the previous year and had been buying up distressed properties, farms whose owners had gone under in the winter fever, or who simply couldn't sustain themselves anymore, and had accepted whatever he offered. He was not cruel in an obvious way. He was smooth and well-dressed and spoke in the measured tones of a businessman, but the result of his presence in the valley was always the same. Another family gone, another parcel absorbed into a larger holding. He sat his horse at the gate and looked at the farm with the cool, assessing eyes of a man reading a balance sheet, and he asked Maria, politely and without apparent malice, whether she had considered selling. "The market for land in this county is favorable at the moment," he said. "I could offer you a fair price, enough to set you and your children up somewhere smaller, more manageable." "This farm is my home," Maria said. She was standing at the gate, not opening it. "It is managed fine, thank you." "Of course," Latimer said, "but I understand you had difficulties with the bank this spring. I wouldn't want to see a woman in your position." "My position," Maria said, "is that of a landowner with a legal loan agreement in good standing. I would appreciate you taking that understanding with you when you leave." Latimer looked at her for a moment. He smiled, the way men smile when they have been told no and intend to take it under advisement rather than seriously. "The offer stands," he said. "You know where to find me." He turned his horse and rode back down the track, and Maria stood at the gate watching him go until the dust settled. She told Walter about it the following Thursday. She told him matter-of-factly, as one describes a problem one has already diagnosed, not as a woman asking for help. Walter's jaw tightened. It was the first time she had seen anything that resembled genuine anger on his face, and even then it was controlled, but the tightness was there. "He's been doing this across the valley," Walter said. "He's taken 3 properties in the last year, all of them from people who were alone and struggling." "I'm not alone," Maria said, and then heard what she had said and looked away. Walter was quiet for a moment. "No," he said eventually, "you're not." "He'll come back," she said. "Probably," Walter said. "You have a legal deed, a current loan agreement, and I suspect you will remain very difficult to pressure. I'm not worried about Latimer as long as you stay on top of the payments." "I have never missed one," she said. "I know," he said, and then quietly, "I check." She looked at him. "You check the bank records." "Schraff tells me when a payment comes in," Walter said with a slight defensiveness. "I have a right to know as cosigner." "You do," she acknowledged, and then, "you check every month." "Yes," he said. "Because you are legally obligated to," she said. "Because," he said, meeting her eyes, "I want to know that you're all right." There was a long silence. "Walter," she said, and the way she said his name now was entirely different from the careful formality of their first conversations. It had gone soft at the edges, like something worn to comfort. "I would like to ask you something directly." "Ask it," he said. "What is this?" she said. "What are we doing?" He looked at her steadily. "I think," he said, "that you already know the answer to that question, but if you want me to say it, I want you to say it," she said. He turned to face her fully, and the evening light fell across his face, and he looked at her with the unguarded directness that was simply the man he was, and he said, "I am in love with you, Maria. I have been since approximately the moment you stood in that bank and told Schraff you had memorized every number on that document. I am not in a hurry, and I am not asking for anything you're not ready to give. But that is the truth of what is happening from my end." Maria breathed in and breathed out. "I have not let myself feel things for a considerable amount of time," she said. "Because feeling things requires a kind of vulnerability that I closed off when Thomas died because I couldn't afford it. I have 2 children and a farm and a loan, and I could not afford to." She stopped. "And then you walked over in that bank and stood beside me, not in front of me. And you said it was because something was wrong and you could make it right." She paused. "I have not stopped thinking about that." "About the bank," he said. "About the fact that you stood beside me," she said. He moved toward her then, slowly and with the same deliberateness with which he did everything, and he took her hand, her calloused, cracked, hard-working hand, and held it in his, and he said nothing, because there was nothing to say that the gesture did not already say. She let him hold her hand. And she thought, yes, this is what this is. And she was not afraid of it, which surprised her because she had expected to be afraid. August came, and with it, a development that shifted the shape of things again. Cord Latimer, apparently deciding that Patience was not achieving his purposes with the Keene farm, began a new tactic. He contacted the bank, not Schraff directly, but the bank's parent institution in Dallas, and submitted a formal complaint claiming that the restructured loan on the Keene property had been improperly authorized, and that the co-signature arrangement was irregular. He was attempting to have the loan agreement invalidated, which would place Maria back in default without the protection of the restructured terms. Maria found out about this when a letter arrived from the bank's Dallas office requesting a meeting to review the agreement. She read the letter at the kitchen table while James was at school and Clara was playing in the yard, and for the first time in a long while, she felt something close to true fear. She drove to the Double C that same afternoon. It was the first time she had been to Walter's property, and the farm presented itself as she had somehow expected it to: orderly, modest, and real. The main house was unpainted wood, solid construction, with a long porch and a barn that looked well-maintained. There were cattle in the east pasture and a kitchen garden beside the house, and Felix was at the corral doing something with a saddle when she pulled in. He looked up and his expression went to a slow smile. "He is inside," Felix said, before she could ask. Walter came out of the house at the sound of the wagon, and when he saw her face he came down off the porch immediately and was at the wagon before she had tied the reins. She handed him the letter. He read it. His jaw went tight again, that controlled anger. "Latimer," he said. "Yes," she said. "He's using a legal mechanism to do what he couldn't do through pressure," Walter said. He folded the letter and gave it back. "He's claiming the co-signature arrangement was irregular because I wasn't present as a pre-existing account holder in good standing at that branch. It's a technical argument and it's a weak one, but it could delay things long enough to, if the loan gets invalidated," Maria began. "It won't," Walter said. He said it with a certainty that had nothing theatrical about it. "I have documentation of every transaction I've had with territorial banks in this region going back 6 years. I'll take it to Dallas myself. I'll present it in front of whatever board they want to convene. My credit is solid and the arrangement was legal. Latimer can make claims all he wants. He doesn't have grounds." "I'll come with you," Maria said. He looked at her. "To Dallas." "It's my loan," she said. "My farm, I will be present." "Of course," he said immediately. "I wouldn't have suggested otherwise." They went to Dallas in the 3rd week of August, a 3-day journey by stage, leaving the children with the Hartwell family 2 miles down the road, a farming family with several children who had been Maria's neighbors for 5 years and whom she trusted. The trip required a deliberate forward motion of trust between them, because they were going as partners in a legal matter, and the fact of that partnership had its own gravity. The meeting with the bank's Regional Review Board was held in a formal office in Dallas that felt very far from the dust and open sky of Harlan Creek. 3 men sat at a long table and reviewed documents with the careful attention of men who had been hired to find problems. Maria presented her loan agreement, her payment record, and a letter from the Harlan Creek town clerk attesting to her good standing as a property owner in the county. Walter presented his letter of credit, his bank transaction records, and a statement from the Cattlemen's Savings Institution in Abilene confirming his credit history. He also presented a letter from a Dallas attorney he had engaged 2 days prior, at his own expense, without telling Maria beforehand, which she discovered when the attorney was introduced, who articulated the legal basis for the co-signature arrangement with precise and complete clarity. The board deliberated for 2 hours. Maria and Walter sat in an anteroom and waited. "You hired an attorney and didn't tell me," Maria said. "I hired an attorney and told you when it mattered," Walter said. "Which was when he was useful. I might have wanted input into the choice of attorney," she said. "He came highly recommended by the Cattlemen's Association," Walter said. "His name is Emmett Cross and he's won every case he's taken in Texas for 4 years. Would you have chosen differently?" Maria considered. "No," she said, "but that's beside the point." "What is the point?" he asked genuinely. "The point," she said with a precision that she had been working up to, "is that I need to be part of the decisions, not informed after, part of them. If we are doing this together, whatever this is, then it is together." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You're right. I'm sorry. I'm used to making decisions alone. I'll do better." She looked at him. The apology was direct and unqualified, and she found she had nothing to add to it. "Good," she said. They sat in silence for a while, and then Maria said, "The attorney, did he read the whole agreement?" "Every line," Walter said. And he said the only way Latimer wins this is if the board is corrupt," Walter said. "And if they are, then we have bigger problems than Latimer." The board was not corrupt. They ruled in Maria's favor. The loan agreement was sound, the co-signature was valid, and Cord Latimer's complaint was dismissed. The letter came through the hotel that evening by messenger, and Maria sat on the edge of the bed in her hotel room and read it twice and then held it in her hands and let herself feel the full relief of it. There was a knock on her door. She opened it. Walter was there without his hat. "I know," he said. "Felix sent a wire to the hotel. He heard from Schraft." "It's over," Maria said. "It's over," he said. She stood in the doorway and looked at him, and the relief and the exhaustion and something that was deeper than either of those things moved through her all at once, and she crossed the 2 feet of space between them and put her arms around him, and he held her solidly, quietly, completely. And she pressed her face against the warmth of his chest and breathed in and out until the shaking in her hands stopped. Neither of them said anything for a while. When she stepped back, she looked up at him, and he looked down at her, and he said, "Maria," and she said, "Yes," and he kissed her gently and with the same careful steadiness with which he did everything, and she kissed him back with considerably less carefulness, because she was a woman who had been careful for 18 months and was done with it. They were married in November of 1882. The ceremony was at the church in Harlan Creek on a Saturday, with the whole town in attendance, because in a town that size there are no private events. The Reverend Caldwell performed the service, which was traditional and brief, as both parties had requested. Felix stood beside Walter, wearing his finest clothes and a deeply satisfied expression, as if events had unfolded exactly according to his private expectations. Clara wore a white dress that Maria had made from a remnant bolt and sat in the front pew looking like a small queen surveying her domain. James stood beside Walter as a second witness with the grave solemnity that was simply his nature, and when he shook Walter's hand after the ceremony, Walter shook back with complete seriousness, as if the transaction mattered, because it did. The question of where they would live had required actual discussion. Maria would not simply absorb herself into the Double C and leave her farm behind. The farm was her work, her history, her thing. Walter's spread was larger and more established, but Walter had said from the beginning that he would go wherever she needed to go, and he meant it. What they settled on, after a great deal of practical conversation, was this. They would divide their time between both properties during the working season, which was manageable given that the two spreads were only 30 miles apart, and they would hire a reliable hand, a young man named Eli, recently arrived from Oklahoma, to manage day-to-day operations at the Double C when Walter was at the Keene farm. In time, they agreed, they would consolidate, but the timeline of that consolidation would be Maria's choice, and Walter would follow her lead. She appreciated this more than she knew how to say, so she said it plainly. "Thank you. It's your home," he said. "We don't leave it unless you're ready." The first winter of their marriage was hard but good. Hard because the winters in Texas Hill Country were always hard, and good because hard things are different when you are not alone. Walter learned the specific geography of the Keene farm, which fence posts were the most problematic, which of the cattle were temperamental, which corner of the south field drained poorly after rain, with the focused attention he brought to everything. Maria learned the rhythms of his presence, that he rose earlier even than she did, that he took his coffee black and very hot, that he was a man who processed difficult things in silence before he was ready to speak about them, and that when he was ready, he spoke with complete honesty. James, within a month of the wedding, began calling Walter by his name rather than Mr. Cooper, which was a small thing but significant. By February, he had taken to riding out with Walter in the mornings to check the cattle, and the sight of the man and the boy on horseback together in the early cold light was something Maria filed away in the particular place where she kept the things that were too important to merely appreciate in the moment. Clara, having already adopted Walter with no reservations whatsoever, consolidated her position by becoming deeply interested in everything he did, and following him around the farm with a commentary that Walter received with endless patience and apparent delight. "She is going to run something large someday," Walter told Maria one evening after Clara had spent 45 minutes explaining to him her theory about why the brown hen was smarter than the other hens. "Probably a territory," Maria agreed. He laughed, and the sound of it in the house, deep and warm, still surprised her sometimes, in the way that good things surprise you after you have been without them for a while. Spring came again, and with it the first full season of working the merged operation. The Keene farm and the Double C managed together as a coordinated whole. Walter arranged for Eli to bring 2 extra head of cattle down from the Double C to strengthen the Keene herd, and they worked out a crop rotation for the south field that would improve the yield while resting the soil, a plan Maria had been thinking about for years and finally had the resources to implement. Cord Latimer, by this point, had left the valley. Whether discouraged by the Dallas ruling or simply moved on to easier opportunities elsewhere, he had sold his local interests and departed sometime in the winter, and the valley exhaled without ceremony in his wake. 3 of the properties he had bought were resold to new families, young homesteaders coming west on the promise of cheap land, and the valley began to repopulate itself in a small way that felt, to those who had been there through the hard times, like something earned. Maria made the final loan payment to the First Territorial Bank of Harlan Creek on the 8th of October, 1883, 14 months after the restructuring, 2 months ahead of her self-imposed schedule. She drove into town alone, which was deliberate, and she laid the final payment on Schraft's counter and received her satisfied loan document, and she looked at Schraft over the counter with her dark eyes and said simply, "I'd like that in writing, please." She brought the document home and showed it to Walter that evening at the supper table. He read it and smiled, a real full smile, the kind she had gradually learned was not his everyday expression but the one that lived underneath everything and came out when something truly good had happened. "You did it," he said. "We did it," she said. "Your name was on that paper. Your work paid it off," he said. "Our work," she said, and held his gaze until he conceded with a nod, because she was not going to accept less than the truth of what they had made together. He leaned across the table and kissed her forehead, and she closed her eyes briefly and rested in it. In the fall of 1883, Maria discovered she was pregnant. She told Walter on a Sunday morning while he was at the kitchen stove making coffee, because she had decided she would not make a ceremony of it. Just tell him the way you tell someone something true and important. He turned from the stove and looked at her, and what moved across his face was not surprise, or not only surprise, but a kind of radiant, undisguised joy that was one of the most honest things she had ever seen on a human face. He crossed the kitchen in 2 strides and took her face in his hands and looked at her and said, "Are you all right? Are you happy?" "Yes," she said. "Both." He held her then, and over his shoulder she could see the kitchen window and the yard and the south field beyond, her land and his land and their life between them. And she thought of all the mornings she had stood on this porch alone and tasted dust, and how that time had made her who she was, and how who she was had led her to this moment, and she felt nothing that resembled regret. James took the news of an expected sibling with the evaluative gravity typical of him, then asked several practical questions about sleeping arrangements and whether the baby would get the larger bedroom. Clara immediately began naming the baby, which process generated 17 names in 48 hours, none of which were agreed upon. "She's going to assign the name before we choose one," Walter told Maria, amused. "Probably," Maria said. "We should decide quickly." The baby was born in June of 1884, in the heat of a Texas summer morning, with the windows open and the prairie air coming through and Felix in the yard below saying a prayer in Spanish that Maria could not understand but appreciated nonetheless. The midwife, a capable woman named Mrs. Adair, who had been delivering babies in Harlan Creek for 20 years, said it was one of the smoother deliveries she had witnessed, which was something Maria filed under the general category of wins she was grateful for. The baby was a boy. Walter held him in the early morning light with the careful reverence of a man holding something that mattered beyond all calculation, and he looked at Maria over the baby's head, and she saw his eyes were full, and she said, "Don't you start." "I'm not starting anything," he said, which was not entirely true. They named him Samuel Thomas Cooper Samuel for no particular reason, except that it sounded right to both of them, and Thomas because there was a man who deserved to be remembered in the life that his work had made possible. Samuel Thomas Cooper arrived with lungs that had opinions, which he expressed frequently and with enthusiasm. And James, who had been worried about the noise, adapted by becoming the most practiced at settling his new brother down, walking him in a determined circle around the kitchen at 2 in the morning with an expression of focused purpose that made Maria love him so fiercely she could hardly breathe. Clara, once she had established that the baby was real and intended to remain, shifted her position from naming committee to head of supervision, which she implemented immediately and without delegation. Life settled into a new shape, larger and more complex, and more full than the shape it had been before. The Keene farm, which was beginning to be called the Cooper Keene farm in the county records, a designation Maria had specifically requested, because she was not erasing where she had come from, had grown into a solid operation. 60 acres under cultivation, 15 head of cattle, a new well, and the repaired and improved farmhouse that bore the marks of both the woman who had built it and the man who had joined his life to hers. Walter had kept the Double C as well, with Eli managing it under his direction, and in 1885 they brought the two operations into a formal partnership agreement drawn up by Emmett Cross, the same attorney who had helped them in Dallas. The partnership was filed under both their names in equal shares, because Walter had insisted on equality and Maria had not argued, because it was simply correct. Felix, who had ridden for Walter for 10 years by then, was given a piece of the partnership as well, a smaller share, representing his years of loyalty and labor, an arrangement Walter had proposed and Maria had supported without hesitation because it was the right thing and she had always recognized right things. "You did not have to do that," Felix told Walter when the papers were signed. "Yes, I did," Walter said. Felix looked at Maria. Maria looked at Felix. Between them passed the unspoken acknowledgement that this was simply the character of the man, and that it was a good character, and that they had both always known it. The spring of 1886 brought the news that the Northern Texas Cattlemen's Association was expanding its membership charter to include smaller combined farm and ranch operations, which had previously been excluded by a membership structure that favored large pure cattle operations. Walter was elected to represent the expanded membership class in the county, a role he accepted with his usual undemonstrative practicality. He brought Maria to the first meeting in his capacity. Some of the men there were surprised to see her. Some were not. The ones who knew Walter had already learned that things done without Maria Keene present were likely to be revisited. She spoke once at that first meeting on the subject of lending practices and bank security requirements for mixed-use properties, and she spoke with a precision and a knowledge of detail that changed the temperature of the room, and when she was done there was a silence, and then a rancher from the eastern county said, "Who was that again?" "That is my wife," Walter said with a pride he made no effort to disguise. "She should be on the committee," the rancher said. "She is," Walter said, "as of right now." Maria looked at him from across the table. He looked back at her, and in his eyes was the same steady, level warmth that had been there since the day in the bank, the thing that had not dimmed or shifted or revealed a hidden condition in 4 years. It was simply there, constant and real, and she knew it would be there tomorrow, and the year after and the year after that. By the autumn of 1886, the Cooper Keene farm had paid off its remaining debts, expanded its cattle herd to 30 head, and was producing a consistent surplus from the wheat and corn fields. Maria had begun, with characteristic deliberateness, to explore the possibility of investing part of that surplus into a small seed business, supplying seeds to neighboring farms in the county through a purchasing cooperative arrangement. She had been discussing the idea with Walter for several months, working out the numbers and the logistics with the same attention she had brought to every financial calculation of her adult life. Walter, for his part, had supported the idea from the first mention of it, which was itself something she found she had come to count on, not his agreement necessarily, but his honest engagement with whatever she brought to him, his willingness to think through it with her rather than pronouncing on it. He had questioned two of her supply chain assumptions in ways that improved the plan, and she had revised accordingly, and the plan was better for it. She submitted the business proposal to a commercial lender in November, with Walter's co-signature again. This time, a formality of partnership rather than a necessity, because her own credit standing was now strong enough to have stood alone, and the loan was approved without complication. Dorian Schraft, who had been present for the application review, had looked at her across the counter with an expression that she chose to read generously as something adjacent to respect. She did not require his respect, but she acknowledged it. On a December evening of that same year, with Samuel 2.5 years old and asleep across the hall, Clara 8 and thoroughly running the household in any practical sense, and James 12 and increasingly his own man, Maria sat on the porch in the cold after supper with a blanket around her shoulders and a cup of coffee in her calloused hands, and watched the stars come up over the ridge. Walter came out and sat beside her. He had a blanket too, and he settled it around himself and sat close enough that their shoulders touched, which was his particular language: proximity without demand, presence without pressure. "The seed cooperative will take 3 years to break even," Maria said, which was a thing she had been calculating in her head. "I know," he said, 4 years to show a real profit." "You ran the same numbers," she said. "Of course I did," he said. She drank her coffee. "I was thinking about getting 2 more head in the spring. The east pasture can support it if the grass comes in the way it did this year." "I think that's right," he said. "Eli mentioned the same thing last week about the double C acreage." "We could consolidate the herds," she said, and felt the weight of the suggestion in the air because they had been circling this for a while: the full consolidation of the 2 properties, the final merging of what had been 2 separate lives into one singular, unified thing. "We could," Walter said, with a neutrality that held the question open. "I think I'm ready," Maria said. He turned to look at her. "To consolidate," she said, "the properties, if you still want to." "I've wanted to for 2 years," he said. "I was waiting for you." "I know you were," she said. He took her hand, the calloused, cracked, worn, and strong hand, and held it between both of his. She looked at their hands together in the starlight, his covering hers, and thought about the bank all those years ago and the way he had stood beside her. And then she thought about everything that had come from that single act of simple human decency, and felt something in her chest that was too large and too complete to have a simple name. "Walter," she said. "Yes," he said. "I'm very glad you stood up," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I didn't have a choice. What was happening to you was wrong. You could have minded your business," she said. "I could have," he said. "But you were in the corner of my business from the moment you walked in, whether you knew it or not. Something about the way you walked, Maria. Like the world owed you nothing and you intended to take nothing from it that wasn't fairly earned." He paused. "I'd never seen anything like it." She turned to look at him. In the starlight his face was the familiar map of him, the angular jaw, the steady eyes that were gray-green in daylight and very dark now, the lines around his mouth that came from sun and weather and, she hoped, from smiling. "I love you," she said. It was something she had said many times now, but she said it with the same specific intention every time, because words like that should always be meant. "I love you," he said, and meant it the same way. They sat on the porch until the cold got serious and the coffee went cold, and then they went inside to the warm house with the children sleeping and the fire low and the stars outside still doing what stars have always done, indifferent and beautiful and permanent over the hill country of Texas. In the spring of 1887, the Cooper Keene properties were formally consolidated into a single land deed, 640 acres running from the western ridge to the northern boundary, registered under both names at the Harlan Creek Land Office by a clerk who spelled Keene wrong the first time, and was corrected by Maria before the ink dried. The consolidation required a week of hard work to finalize in practical terms: moving equipment, reorganizing the herd, establishing a new rotation schedule for the combined acreage. Eli stayed on as head hand with a formal salary, and a small house of his own on the northern portion of the property that Walter had the frame up for before the deed was even signed. Felix, whose age had been slowing him down through the previous winter, moved into a room in the main house that Clara had helped prepare, and settled into the role of elder statesman of the operation with a dignity that suited him completely. The Double C house, Walter's original house, became the main residence, because it was larger, though Maria had insisted on bringing the kitchen table from the Keene farmhouse, which had been Thomas's mother's table, because some things are not merely furniture. The table sat in the kitchen of the combined house, its worn surface holding cups of coffee and loan documents and homework and bread dough, and the ordinary, extraordinary accumulation of a life shared, and Maria ran her hand over it sometimes in the morning while the coffee was brewing, in the way you touch things that connect you across time. James, at 12, was riding the property lines with Walter twice a week, and had begun to talk, with a 13-year-old's mixture of ambition and uncertainty, about whether ranching was what he wanted to do when he was older. Walter listened to these conversations with complete seriousness and offered no pressure in any direction, which was itself a kind of wisdom. "You don't have to want what we have," Walter told him once, which Maria heard from the doorway. "You should want what fits you. Whatever that is will help you get there." James looked at him for a long time. Then he said, "I think I want to be a lawyer like Mr. Cross." Walter nodded. "Then we'll make sure you get the schooling," he said, and that was that. Clara, at 8, had no such uncertainty about her future, which she was planning in considerable detail, and which seemed to involve horses, a large piece of land, and an unspecified number of animals that currently did not live on the property but would. Samuel, at 3, wanted to be Felix, which Felix found deeply gratifying. In the fall of 1887, Maria discovered she was pregnant again. She told Walter in the kitchen on a Tuesday morning while he was helping her shell beans, because she had discovered that important news was best delivered without ceremony in the middle of ordinary life. He stopped shelling beans. He looked at her. "Happy?" he asked, the same question as before. "Very," she said. He leaned across the table and kissed her thoroughly, and Samuel, who was on the floor playing with a wooden horse Felix had carved him, looked up and said, with the confidence of a 3-year-old who has formed opinions. The second baby arrived in April of 1888, on a morning that smelled of spring rain and new grass and the particular clean freshness of the Texas hill country after a night of rain. She was a girl, which Clara received as a deeply personal gift from the universe, and they named her Elena Ruth Cooper Elena because it was a name that suited her from the first moment. Ruth because it was Walter's mother's name, and he had mentioned it once, quietly, as a name he had always liked. Elena Ruth Cooper arrived with a calm disposition that contrasted pleasingly with her brother Samuel's vocal energy, and she observed her new world with wide, interested eyes that seemed from the first week to already be forming conclusions. "She has your eyes," Walter told Maria. "She has your patience," Maria said. "That's a good combination," Walter said. "Formidable," Maria agreed. The spring moved through its brightness and warmth, and the Cooper Keene property, still called that by most of the county, a double name that had taken hold and stuck, went into the 1888 growing season as a healthy, productive operation with a family at its center that was large enough to fill a house and strong enough to weather most of what the West could throw at it. Maria stood on the porch of the Double C house on a Saturday morning in May, Elena in her arms and Samuel sitting on the steps with Felix, watching Walter and James ride the north fence line in the early light. Clara was in the barn doing something that had been described as essential and was probably also unauthorized, and the smell of coffee came through the kitchen door, and the wildflowers were up along the creek, and the sky over Texas was doing what it does, enormous and clear and luminous, the kind of sky that makes you understand why people came west and kept coming and refused to leave. She held her daughter and watched the man she loved ride across the land they shared, and thought of a morning 4 years ago when she had driven a wagon into town alone with loan papers, folded against her chest and dust in her teeth, and not a single safe harbor in sight. She thought of walking into a bank with calloused hands and proud eyes, and a man she did not know rising from a chair in the corner and changing everything with 3 words. She had paid him back in 10 months and kept her promise and built her life and found her love and made her family and stood on her ground. And none of it had been given to her, all of it had been earned. Every acre and every harvest and every morning on this porch. Earned through work and grief and stubbornness, and the willingness to accept help when help was offered with honest hands. Walter turned on his horse at the far end of the field and saw her on the porch. Even at that distance she could see him change, that subtle shift in his posture, the almost imperceptible movement of warmth that went through him when he looked at her. He raised a hand, she raised hers back. A leaner made a sound against her neck, a small, contented noise. Samuel looked up. "Mama," he said, "is Papa coming back soon?" "Soon," she said. Samuel nodded, satisfied, and went back to his game. Felix, from his chair on the step below, said, without looking up from the harness he was mending, "This is a good place." "Yes," Maria said, "it is." She had walked into that bank with nothing but herself and the papers that proved what she had built, and what she had built had been enough. Not because the world had decided to be fair, but because she had refused to accept anything less than what was right, and because a man in a corner had stood up. She pulled Eleanor closer and breathed in the spring air of her property and her life, and felt fully, openly, without reservation, the particular and irreplaceable joy of a woman who has lost things and rebuilt them and found, in the rebuilding, something she had not known to hope for. Something like this. Something exactly like this. The years ahead would bring their own complications. The seasons of drought and the seasons of plenty. The growing pains of children becoming people. The slow and honored passage of Felix from working hand to family elder, to a grave on the north slope of the property that everyone agreed was exactly where he would have wanted to be, overlooking the fence line he had helped repair on a spring afternoon in 1882. They would bring new challenges for the seed cooperative, which expanded into 3 counties by 1891, with Maria managing the financial side with a precision that made the commercial lender who had approved the original loan occasionally wonder what he had been thinking, questioning any of her projections. They would bring James riding east to study law with a letter of recommendation from Emmett Cross and the certain, steady knowledge that his family was behind him. They would bring Clara growing into exactly the person she had always clearly been going to be, headstrong and brilliant and entirely her own, eventually taking on the full management of the property's livestock operations in a way that made even the most skeptical men of the county concede, reluctantly and then less reluctantly, and then without reservation, that she was the best at it. They would bring Samuel eventually, becoming a rancher after all, not because it was expected of him, but because he had grown up with the land under his feet and it had gotten into him, and there was no point arguing with that. They would bring Eleanor in time, becoming a teacher in Harlan Creek, the same school she had attended as a small girl with wide and assessing eyes, a woman who carried her mother's calm determination and her father's quiet steadiness, and used both in the service of other people's children. And through all of it, the complications and the plenty and the grief and the joy, the full and changing decades of a life shared on 640 acres of Texas hill country, there was the kitchen table from the Keene farmhouse, holding whatever needed to be held. There were 2 people who chose each other every morning, in the plain and unremarkable way that is the only real choosing, in the coffee and the cattle and the fence lines, and the late evenings on the porch when the work was done, and the stars were out, and there was nothing left to say except what had already been said and would be said again, because some things deserve to be said over and over and over. There was Maria, who had walked in alone with her calloused hands and her proud eyes, and there was Walter, who had stood up. And from that one simple act of decency, from that particular Tuesday morning in the First Territorial Bank of Harlan Creek in the spring of 1882, everything good and true and lasting had followed, the way spring follows winter, the way water follows the land, the way love follows, when it is the real kind everything else.